Good morning, or good afternoon, depending on which time zone you're in. I'm Bob Stark from Kyriba, and I wanted to welcome you to today's webinar, The True Value of Treasury Management Systems in the Evolving Role of Treasury. In today's session, there's a couple of logistics we want to go through before we really get into it. Number one, as the recording said, you are in listen-only mode, which means that you can say all the things you want, you can type on your keyboard, you can multitask, you can entertain a meeting at the same time. We won't hear you, which is the good thing. On the flip side, if you want to ask questions, actually asking the question verbally isn't going to get you so far. So as a result, you can type those into the webinar console that you see on the right side of your screen. Simply ask a question anytime you want, and we will address as many of those as we can towards the end of the session. Typing those questions in isn't going to disturb us in any way, so feel free. Don't need to save it up to the end. You can ask at any time, but we will answer at the end. If you're having any technical issues, there's a number on the screen. Now, that being said, if you were seeing this but not hearing me, it doesn't really matter what I say right now. But if you are hearing me only and are having trouble seeing the slide, which is webinar logistics right now, then you might have a bit of a problem with the video connection. And if that's the case, then either feel free to drop off and try and log in again, or there's a phone number, 1-888-259-8414, which is technical support by GoToWebinar. Now, a couple of quick notes. CTP accreditation, you do get CTP credits for this, which is probably why many of you are joining. And if you are, or even if that's not the reason why you're joining, you can still get them anyway. Those approval letters will be emailed out by Kyriba within a few days after the session to all of the full session attendees. I stress that part because AFP stresses that part. And as a result, we can see and we have to report if you were on for the whole time or just showed up for 5 minutes. Lastly, and the most fun part, of course, is when you want to listen to this again and again and again, just to keep entertained. The recorded webinar and the slides will be posted at Kyriba's website, and we'll also email you all of that, all those links, and making sure that you can download the webinar, download the slides anytime that you want. We certainly encourage you to keep doing that, just because I know that you'll definitely want to make sure you listen again and again. It's going to be a great webinar. So, today's presenters. So I'm actually joined by an exceptional individual in Treasury. I think most of you actually know Chad quite well. He's definitely quite active in the Treasury community. But if you don't, Chad, welcome aboard. Thanks for taking the time to join the webinar. And actually, perhaps did you want to do a quick introduction of yourself, just for those few folks on the phone that might not be aware of you, might not have seen you at conferences?
Sure. Thanks, Bob. I'm not sure if I can do much better than that introduction, but Chad Wecklow with Actualize. A lot of what we focus on is what's going to be talked about today, which is leveraging, improving your business process, and in large extent leveraging Treasury technology. And so it's a perfect fit for what we spend a lot of our time on.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And in many cases, there's a lot of organizations that come to us for business cases when they're looking to get into a Treasury technology project. As an example, we oftentimes bring in Chad's team to actually perform those business cases to give a nice objective view. So, Chad, I definitely appreciate from a business standpoint our partnership, but also your expertise and insight for today's webinar. So, let's kind of get into it and today's agenda. Very sunny, bright-looking agenda based on the slide itself. So the main topics of discussion, number one, why value is important. Why would you care if a TMS gives you value? There's probably some very simple, obvious answers to that, but we want to drill down in a little bit further and just make sure you understand what it could be important, why it could be important to find a little bit more justification for your business case as an example. This second point, downplaying productivity benefits. You can consider that foreshadowing as an example in terms of some of the stuff that we might be talking about, but I take a very strict view on the fact that productivity alone does not justify the value of a TMS and isn't going to get you very far in creating a business case. We'll talk a little bit about that and really launch into what I call a value creation hierarchy, kind of like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs for Treasury systems. And then that's going to segue very nicely into Chad's excellent contribution with real life examples, realized value creation, and different opportunities to understand how do I capture value, how to understand what I expect to get, how can I turn that into something real and tangible that I can use to justify getting the Treasury technology in the first place. We will definitely leave some time for questions at the end, and we certainly welcome you to ask those at any time, as I said a moment ago. So let's get into it. First things first, building a business case. That's why most people probably look to value. I mean, you want a TMS to provide value every day, of course. You don't want it to be something sitting in the corner, collecting dust, not being very useful. But a lot of folks, and especially quite a few of the attendees that I know on the phone that have been looking at Treasury technology, have to build a business case. There's no longer an opportunity to just avoid a business case. Budget just isn't handed out anymore. You can make an argument it never was, but it certainly was a lot easier to get than it is these days. And so whether it's formal or informal, that justification has to be presented in terms of things like ROI, value, all that sort of stuff, which is why understanding the value of a TMS becomes so important. Now, the bold statement I'm making here, as I said a moment ago as well, is that productivity isn't enough. You do need to come up with quantitative and qualitative benefits, and especially quantitative, to really assess that value and what it means to your organization. But just the time savings doesn't do the trick anymore. And the main reason why is because productivity is effectively a soft benefit. In almost every case, and I've been in this space for a long time, too long, but what I have seen is that Treasury doesn't get downsized for improving productivity. There's this old adage, you still have a job. In fact, you have a better job by being more productive, more efficient, and be able to save time to free yourself up for other responsibilities. The interesting thing, if you think about it, is that if there are time savings, and inevitably there are, and we'll talk a little bit about what some of those opportunities can be, but those time savings come across the entire team, not literally just from one individual. So even if there was, in theory, a scenario to downsize Treasury as a result of having better technology, which again is so rare, and I've seen it really never. Even if that was the case, you'd have to realign all the team's responsibilities just to free up that one headcount, and that's just not realistic. So that's why you can't really use productivity in business case, because you will not be able to actually save that FTE. You're not saving 2 hours of someone's time. You're taking that 2 hours of someone's time and applying it to other roles. You're not taking away a person, so you're not taking away a hard cost. The only opportunity, exception to that, which I've italicized at the bottom of the slide, is actually if you can avoid hiring new headcount. So that headcount avoidance, that actually is a quantitative saving, and that can be driven off these same functions, which is why we continue to look at productivity in a business case. But if you think, okay, I save 4 hours of my day, that's 50% of my time, that's 50% of an FTE for a business case, that's not really the right way to think about it, and most CFOs will look at that and say, I'm not really saving money, I'm just reallocating your time to something better. So that's why I start with that and really segue that into the bottom of this, what we call the value creation hierarchy, is because productivity is important, but it's really the bottom level of the pyramid, and you're not going to build much of a business case upon that. So when we talk about things like productivity, you can see the bullet points for yourselves: single point of data entry, eliminating errors, making sure that those repetitive tasks are done more efficiently. Effectively, what you're trying to do is find opportunities where you could be spending your time on better things that are more valuable to the organization. That kind of enablement is what's going to uncover some of the opportunities that might drive bigger value for the organization, for the Treasury team. So when we say productivity on its own may not necessarily drive that value, it's what productivity enables that starts to get really interesting. So if you measure TMS on time savings alone, you're just not going to get that far. You start looking at some of these examples that I've put up on the slide, like streamlining your payments process, forecasting. Certainly automating GL entries is one that most people that use Treasury systems jump towards right away, even bank reporting as well. These are obvious ones that if you're doing it in a manual environment, it tends to be very laborious, and it tends to be something that is the first thing to go and to be able to be more automated and more productive. But that being said, these hours saved divided by an hour per day or 8 hours per day, giving you that FTE cost, it's still something that you really have to be careful about how you put in that business case, because you don't want that to take away from the credibility of all the other things that are going to be very important that you want to quantify and be able to present the value on. So if we launch quickly from productivity and look more at the next step. So if we're talking about, say, a manual environment as an example, and we're talking about spreadsheets, so in the previous slide where we're saying, look, here's all the things you can do, wrong direction. So if you're looking at all of the single point of data entry, eliminating rekeying errors, what there is besides just improving time, there's actually a great opportunity to improve the financial controls. So by just simply introducing audit trails, by introducing a segregation or separation of duties, that actually really introduces better controls for the organization. And by doing that, that really allows us to start looking at benefits in a slightly different way. So when I say in a slightly different way, I'm talking about things like data integrity. I'm talking about controlled workflows, centralized audit trails, but the bottom one is the one that really stands out in today's environment. And that's where we have the reduced possibility of fraud. Now, fraud, unfortunately, is too big a topic, and one that we really need to make sure is taken care of, and this is actually where you start to see some value. And so if you look at some of these different examples under fraud, it's not easy to quantify overall, but just look at some of the different opportunities. If we can reduce the likelihood of fraud, and there's a lot of different tools there that can do that in terms of having better workflows around payments so that you think, okay, maybe we were a little bit exposed, maybe we had disparate payment workflows. Now we have reduced that possibility by 50%, which is a bit arbitrary, but nonetheless, you want to put some number, some stake in the ground to say we've reduced the likelihood of this event occurring, in our opinion. Then that's where you can start to quantify it. So if you reduce the likelihood of fraud by 10% as an example, and the cost of a fraudulent payment on average could be, let's just say $1 million as an example, which again, it's something you have to subjectively come to an assessment on. But if you can make that assessment, then what you'll be able to get is some sort of number that says our Treasury technology, our TMS, actually can drive or protect this level of value. Now, the fraud one's a little bit harder to figure out. The likelihood of errors is a lot easier. I think we all appreciate the benefit that spreadsheets, or initially, don't have. Spreadsheets are really good at hiding errors. Now, they're exceptional at hiding errors, and I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but I think that you all know that there's a really good reality behind that. If you can reduce the possibility of errors, so those errors, you can see broken formulas, extra zeros, duplicate payments, all that sort of stuff can definitely happen with spreadsheets, especially the formulas and the what we call the fat fingering, adding an extra zero or mistyping something. All of those things can happen, and the likelihood of those is so high. So the percentage or the probability of that event occurring, you can reduce that from, in fairness, something that's in the 80% likelihood to happen. You're going to have errors 80, 90% of the time, according to every study that's out there. If you can reduce the likelihood of that happening and then quantify the value of what you're protecting, like what would that error cost me? That's, you can get really detailed with this, so you might have to make some just larger assessments or just general judgments in terms of what is the value of that error. What would it cost the organization if we had a broken formula or if we had an extra zero typed into a contract, and we've all heard these stories happening. What does that actually mean for the organization? So again, you're going to have to maybe make some larger assessments as opposed to go over every single possible scenario and assign some sort of dollar value to that, because that could be, well, that would certainly take a lot of time and maybe a little bit more laborious than you're looking for in a business case. But this is the way to potentially approach it, to really what percent of that event can I expect to reduce? What would be the cost of that event happening if it did occur? And that's the best way to quantify this in terms of things like financial controls. Now, those ones are a little bit more difficult. As we get into visibility, it becomes quite a bit easier, actually. So visibility can mean different things to different people. I put some reasonable ideas about visibility. On the cash side, we're looking at things like actual bank reporting, our balances and our transactions. Cash positions, how much money do I expect to have today or maybe extending the next couple days. Forecasting obviously takes that into a lot longer horizon. Most treasuries will forecast days, weeks, months into the future. Some will actually go beyond a year, but obviously that's where you start to dovetail a little bit with what you would see from the FP&A side. So there's obviously different group within the organization, which Treasury obviously should be collaborating with, to ensure that when you're looking to projections like free cash flow, that you're looking at the top-down versus bottom-up method. Treasury is more of a bottom-up method. FP&A is more of a top-down, look from an accrual basis or a budget basis and start taking things out or backing things out that are non-cash items to get to, in effect, the same number of what is our expected cash flow and free cash flow for a certain period of time, say 1 year in the future. So typically Treasury doesn't forecast too much beyond that. But that being said, whatever certainty that you can bring in terms of establishing better visibility, you're going to be in a better position to be able to show value. If you can forecast up to 1 year more accurately, then you're going to be in a position where you can drive more value. On the financial position side, it's pretty obvious. Most treasuries, investments, debt, intercompany, foreign exchange, other stuff on the derivative side, either interest rate or on the commodity side for some organizations, whatever kind of contracts you have, making sure that's incorporated in your visibility so that you're not caught out with anything, and more to the point, you have a good expectation of here's what my commitments are, here's what the cash flows that are generated from those are, so that you can make sure your cash and financial position visibility is perfectly integrated. On the exposure side, from most standpoint, most of the exposures we're talking about are everything from financial risk management, so FX and interest rate, sometimes counterparty, which has become more prevalent over the past several years, since 2009, and then something that's a bit more recent to Treasury. It may be new for some on the phone, or some may be quite collaborative exercise with other parts of the organization to understand what exposures the supply chain and customer chain offer the organization. So there's a lot of a big move to supply chain finance as an example, where Treasury gets involved with AP, with credit, with other parts of the organization that manage suppliers and customers to really understand what am I exposed to? What happens if this supplier is unable to meet their commitments? What happens if these customers go away? How are we exposed as an organization from a revenue and cash flow standpoint? So when we think about visibility, the key thing I'll say in terms of linking that to value is that, number one, the value of visibility is completely in the decisions it enables. Visibility into cash is kind of irrelevant unless you're able to do something with that added visibility. So just having 90% instead of 100% visibility, so what, unless you're actually able to do something with that. The value comes in the decisions that that extra visibility enables. So there's a couple quick calculations and ways that you can do it, but you're going to find that most of these examples come in the next section, effective financial decisions, that I'll talk about, because you're doing something with that visibility. You've uncovered more cash that you found in certain either parts of the organization or certain markets geographically that you're working in, and you're able to do something with that. You're able to put it to use, you're able to pay down debt, you're able to do something, which is really the kind of financial decisions that we all aspire to in Treasury. So there's not a lot of value that I'm going to talk about here in visibility. There's a couple points though. Number one, so bank accounts, and this is an example of decision making. Number one, if I have visibility into bank accounts, if I have visibility in my bank fees, and I have visibility into my actual reporting within those bank accounts, that gives me the ability to make better decisions around bank accounts. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. Same thing with idle pockets of cash. If you have that visibility in bank reporting and you can understand what balances that you didn't know you had, for example, or if they're a little higher than realized, then you're going to be able to do something with extra cash. That's what I mean by finding extra cash. I mean, it wasn't really lost per se, it just wasn't completely visible and transparent to you. So when I'm saying visibility is effective in that it enables decisions, let's talk about what those decisions are. So from an excess cash and liquidity standpoint, a couple different examples, and we'll spend a little bit more time on this, and certainly Chad will go through this as well, is we can invest longer. We can pay down debt. We can maybe have excess cash liquidity that we can use to gain supplier discounts, kind of like supply chain financing model. All of those allow us to either earn a direct or implied rate of return that means that we're putting our cash to work. So if you find, unquote, if you find and uncover more cash through better visibility, it creates the opportunity to make these kind of decisions around investing for longer, repaying debt, which obviously saves interest expense, and maybe even paying your suppliers earlier in return for a 1, 2, 3, some sort of % discount, which if you multiply that for the days that you actually paid them early, your APR can easily be in the double figures. Sometimes it can be 14, 20% in that range. Oftentimes it's at least 8 to 10%, and sometimes a little bit higher than that, depending on the scenario you have with your suppliers and what markets you're in, etc. Point is that there's value in finding that excess cash and liquidity and then putting it to use. Part two, especially for global organizations, cash mobility is extremely important. So we talk about things like netting and pooling and cash repatriation. You can't make those decisions until you have certainty as to what your cash balances are and what your funding requirements and your needs for that cash are going to be. And obviously there's a component of tax involved here when we're talking about moving money across borders. So all these decisions have to be made in conjunction with tax. But the key thing is in understanding that value, you need to be able to, A, get your visibility before you can start really putting it to use, especially in the latter one with cash repatriation. If you're going to be bringing money back into the U.S. from foreign markets, you definitely want to be sure that you're not leaving yourself short, that you're funding all of your future obligations for 3, 6, 9 months, whatever duration you're comfortable with, until you can re-earn enough cash to then fund those obligations again. So you need to ensure that you're not missing anything. That's where an effective forecast comes in combination with that cash mobility. I think risk management is pretty obvious. If you have a hedging program, you need visibility in what your exposures are. If you're trying to do things, simple analysis, like I want to save my bank fees, I want to be able to reduce bank accounts, again, you need the visibility to start making those kind of decisions. So there's a couple of examples that we can go through here. The first one I'll talk about is cash forecasting. Pretty obvious. If you improve your forecast accuracy, when I say improve forecast accuracy, that in itself could almost be an entire presentation. The key thing to improving your forecast accuracy is, number one, you need to understand, I need to get a better forecast. I need to get better sources into my forecast. I need to do some sort of modeling. I need to get some sort of forecast together that I think is pretty representative of the different types of information that I have both in and outside the organization. I don't want to just use it as purely a treasury model. I want to be able to look at maybe regional controllers. I want to be able to tap information from my ERP system like payables and receivables. So you go through this exercise to create your forecast. Number two, you obviously have to marry what I think was going to happen with what actually occurred. So you need to be bringing in your bank actuals to measure against that. And then the third part is you need to, and this is the part I stress the most, you need to really understand what are my variances at each point in time. It is nice, but honestly not incredibly effective, if all you do is say, okay, I did a 90-day forecast. I took a picture of that forecast on January 1st. And then at the end of 90 days, so April 1st, at the end of Q1, I took another snapshot and said, great, how well did I do? Well, if you're looking at a duration such as 3 months, you're missing a lot of potential bumpiness and a lot of variances, and it's really not going to tell you anything more than just say, yes, you were mostly accurate. But you don't know if you were completely off and missing the forecast completely for several weeks within that quarter, and then on the same side, you were over forecasting, and so you basically had this up and down behavior that you just weren't capturing. You were missing that detail. If that's the case, then you really miss that opportunity to understand how effective is my forecast, and you really are making assessments that you are accurate and making decisions based on that forecast simply because you thought over a 90-day window that you were pretty close. You were 95% accurate at the end of that without looking at the detail within it. So it's very important to be taking multiple snapshots through a forecast period. A forecast period like 12 weeks or 13 weeks, I should say, 90 days. That's very common, but a lot of organizations will break that up into 1 or 2 week buckets. So maybe you have 6 or 7 assessment points through those 13 weeks to understand, is my forecast still on track? Not just waiting until the whole period is over, but interim assessments. And by doing that, you're really going to understand detailed level, by line item, by business unit, whatever breakdowns that you're trying to do, you're really going to understand, is this forecast accurate and reliable? If you know that it's accurate and reliable, you're going to be much more confident in making decisions such as, I'm going to reduce the amount of idle cash. I'm going to maybe invest for longer durations, maybe in investments that are not as liquid as I might have been doing before. And as a result, what that means is that I can start earning much better returns on cash. Even at these interest rates, you can still earn significant money on just $10 million of idle cash. For most organizations that are multi-billion-dollar organizations, finding $10 million of cash isn't incredibly difficult, but being able to generate $100,000 a year can actually really help the budget in Treasury, because we don't even know you manage hundreds of millions and billions of dollars. Treasury budget's 100K in a Treasury budget isn't too bad. That actually can help a lot of different things, especially if you're looking to find a way to justify brand new Treasury technology. So the key with forecasting, very simply, make sure your forecast is accurate, make sure you're certain and confident, because then you can start making serious decisions. You can say, if my forecast says that I'm going to have $100,000 extra in this account, great. I know that I'm going to have $100,000 extra in that account, and I can do something with it. That's the kind of really qualification that we're looking for, and the kind of level of laser focus that we're looking for in cash forecasting. Now, switching to hedging, for those that have, say, some sort of FX program or would like to have some sort of FX program, the same conclusion is offered. A better forecast means a better hedging program because you have confidence. So I see a lot of organizations that their hedging policy is fairly conservative. Maybe they're only hedging 50% of their exposures, and they'd like to do a little bit more, but they're just not sure. They don't have confidence in their exposure forecast, which may oftentimes be driven by the fact they don't have confidence in their cash forecast. So, and I know these are very glossy and simple numbers, but if you just look at it, if you have even a little bit of variation in currencies, such as a 1% increase in US dollars over, say, generally speaking, the basket of currencies that you're hedging against, and I think we know with volatility, 1% change in USD versus other currencies, I mean, that can happen literally in a day. Never mind over a period of 30, 60, 90 days or 6 months. So this kind of volatility we know happens. We know there's a lot of bumps in the road, a lot of roller coaster up and down within that. So as a result, the more confidence that you can have in your exposure forecast means that you can potentially increase your hedge coverage. Now, simple example, $500 million of U.S. revenue, you have a 1% change, that becomes $495 million. It's $5 million lost. So if you can do things like increase your hedge coverage 50 to 55%, 50 to 75%, which I know seems crazy talk, but nonetheless, if you're in a position to be able to do that, there's real value that you are protecting. That turns into very quantifiable benefit that an organization can make decisions on, and you can also prove it. You can prove it. You can look at the last 6 months, last year, last 2 years, and if you were only hedging a portion, or maybe not hedging any of that volatility, you can look at it and said, if we had done contracts, let's say January 1st of last year, if we'd done a series of forward contracts, very simple hedges, and we protected this volatility, maybe exposure to euro, exposure to Latin American or Asian currencies, whatever it might be for your organization. If we were able to do those things, then here's what would have happened. Here's the amount of revenue that we would have protected. Here's the bottom line impact to the organization we would have had if we had hedged a little bit differently. And obviously then you can work your way back to the mechanics that you needed from a technology solution and the TMS to be able to get to that point. So that's the kind of idea. Now, obviously, this could be a presentation upon itself as well, but just to kind of introduce the idea. The bank fees one, this example is pretty simple. There's not a lot of logic and expertise and wisdom here. It's pretty obvious. If you can, and obviously any TMS, can enable rationalization of bank accounts, if you can do that simply by understanding your bank fees, understanding what you do with those bank fees, then you're in a position to maybe reduce some of those fees. So number one, I just want to understand if my fees are accurate. That's what bank fee analysis is all about. Are my fees accurate? Do they represent what my pricing schedule with my banks is supposed to be? Yes or no. Part two is, okay, this bank fee analysis tells me that the cost of bank fees, the cost of my bank accounts is X. Now, I can marry that up with, here's what I actually use those bank accounts for. So here's what I'm using the accounts for. Maybe some of them are fairly underutilized as an example. Here's what that bank account cost me, because my bank fee analysis statements tell me that. I'm in a position to start rationalizing accounts, that $50,000 to $100,000 a year. That benefit grows dramatically when you can start closing bank accounts simply by reducing your bank fees, which was simply driven by the fact that I have some sort of threshold that says if I'm not using bank accounts to this level, if I only have one transaction every 2 weeks going through it, I probably don't need that account. I can start closing things and start saving significant money. If you can prove that that's part of your business case, that's going to generate a lot of money to more than pay for a TMS quite easily. Now, last one I want to talk about briefly, and then I want to hand things over to Chad to go through some much more depth and great examples, is on fraud prevention. So again, we talked a little bit about some of the financial controls and different ways to look at fraud. I just wanted to really reinforce that point, is that obviously there's certain controls that you can put in place for cash management, for payments, for bank accounts, all those sorts of things. A lot of different scenarios, and I'm sure most of you that are on the webinar have done your reading, that suggests that directly that financial loss can be easily $100K. There's lots of examples. Of course, these are the horror stories where there are multi-millions of dollars. But the fact is, these things happen. And if you can avoid that, as well as any reputational risks that goes along with that, because generally if you get hacked and you're a publicly traded company, it's quite significant. It's going to get in the news somehow, and that's going to have a lot of other, we'll say, costs, which could be quite significant. But if you can, again, just assess, here's what we've done. We've protected our organization a little bit better. We've protected our cash management, our payments workflows. We've protected the separation of duties around our bank accounts. We feel more confident that we've reduced the risk of fraud by X%, and then you just look at the different events multiplied by the X%. That helps to give you better decision making and better value for the TMS. So the only other part that I'll mention here, and then I want to definitely give Chad a great opportunity to talk through a lot of different examples, is that Treasury is a strategic partner. If you look at this whole pyramid, so effective financial decisions is kind of where a lot of this value comes from. We've talked about a few of those examples, and there's umpteen other examples that we could go through, but hopefully it gives you an idea of the way to start thinking about it. Treasury as a strategic partner, that actually gets beyond just Treasury, and it gets into collaborating with other parts of the organization to drive even more value. And there's lots of different examples of this. I know Chad has some to talk about too, but the whole idea is that as you work your way up, each level of this pyramid allows you to find and generate more value for the organization. It's all about the technology, not necessarily offering a report that does this, but enabling better decisions, better collaboration, offering better insight, giving analysis that can help other parts of the organization that can ultimately drive more value overall for the company. Value for Treasury, yes, but value for the organization as a whole. And you can see some of the categories in terms of better business continuity, helping with regulatory compliance, obviously operational and financial performance, but risk management is certainly one of those ones that jumps out as well. So there's a lot of different opportunities, and more than we'll go through today. But what I do want to do is make sure that get this, that there is more value as you go into better Treasury decisions, and then ultimately collaboration with the rest of the organization, whether it's other groups within finance or whether even groups that sit outside finance that you can help with your insight, your wisdom, the extra time that you now have through using a TMS compared to maybe a more manual environment. all of these contribute to the overall value of a treasury management system. So with that, Chad, I want to turn it over to you and talk about really some of these real-life realized value creation that you've talked about.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bob. So I think the goal of really what I'm hoping to do today is, take some of what Bob has talked about across the different pieces of the hierarchy and try to give you some examples of how we've seen clients take advantage of some of these opportunities, and maybe help you guys ponder about how you could take that back to your organization and potentially leverage it. One thing we do here with our clients is try to help them think through how they're going to get from where they are today to where they want to be. And you can see here, I think this is an example of how a best-in-class treasury may look for some organizations, and I think your organization may look slightly different, but the thought is behind it is you really want to get from something where you're really more reacting and more of an operational daily grind where you're just trying to get through all your tasks to one where you actually have time to look at the data, analyze it, make decisions that are predictive as well as proactive that you can then convey across the organization. So what we would encourage our clients to do, or really anybody to do, is to sort of see how your organization fits in and what bullets you would have in these boxes and how that means to your organizations. And then if we carry forward, we'll go through some examples. So as Bob mentioned, productivity is sort of the base of what you need, but as we'll see, it's a very important base. Obviously, you can't build a house without a foundation, and the productivity is sort of the foundation that allows you to move forward with some of these other opportunities that we're talking about. So for each of these examples, I'll try to give some specifics of what our clients have done and think about areas that some of them you probably thought about and potentially you're doing as well within your organizations. Some of them I think are things that people maybe not think about quite as much, or at least they thought about, but maybe not the importance of them. So specifically in the productivity slide, the way I really think about it is, if you think about a treasury management system, you have a database that is allowed to be accessed by many groups and has a lot of very specific functionality in it that's tailored towards the treasury organization. So to the extent that you can leverage that, I would say be very creative on what data you can capture and what you can put into that system. And we'll go through some specific examples, but our view of where you really start to get value is where you're starting to bring in multiple functional groups within that. So those could include your AP, your AR, it could include your tax group, your accounting group, your FP&A group, obviously the treasurer group, but I'm talking about groups in addition to that. So what are areas within the organization where you can leverage them? So Bob was talking a little bit about business cases. One of the easiest wins, in my opinion, for business cases is when you start to include other people in the conversation. So it's not just the treasury project, but you make it a project or initiative that includes other groups, and you're able to convey that that benefit that could be leveraged across multiple groups. Then you really start to get a true value proposition, and you're starting to get other sponsors within the organization that can chime in to the conversation as well. So, and I'll go through hopefully some examples today, but those are some groups that you can think about leveraging and including in and trying to figure out what value they can leverage from the TMS as well, and some of that may require, which sort of goes down into it, integration with other systems. So clearly they can't use the system if there's not data in the system that is useful for them, and so that would require some integration with other parts of the organization, which would include obviously your banks, your ERP systems, any other type of sales databases that you may have. Really, anything where you have financial information could be there. I've listed some examples that are here. That tight integration is really key. So if you're trying to get data into the system, but you're still manually putting data into the system, or you have data in system A, but then you're just manually typing into the TMS, really that prevents you from truly utilizing and achieving the productivity gains that you need to. You have the data in the system that allows you to do it, but now you don't have time because you spent half your time just getting the data into the system. So really investing in integration with some of these industry portals or market data providers or your banking partners is really, really key to allowing you to actually have the time to do the additional analysis that I think part of the goals and part of the benefit we'll get to are there. And I think Bob mentioned as well, integration to the subledger. And again, I guess the one thing here, I think this is sort of a no-brainer, but the piece that I wanted to highlight is, well, what can we actually journalize? I mean, there's all your financial activity that you can, so whether it be your funding, whether it be your investments, obviously all your cash activity can also be journalized if you're bringing your bank statements in to the system, all of your hedging, including some of your accounting, disclosure reporting. All of these things can be journalized, and to the extent that you're able to achieve that, then again, you're really providing quite a bit of value as opposed to just having an interface through some ledger. You're also automating the creation of the journal entries. There's still a lot of companies out there that are doing their accruals for their funding vehicles in Excel. They're doing cash accounting as more of a manual exercise. So to the extent that you can put all of that information in the system, integrate it with the various platforms, perform and set up the accounting for it, then you're interfacing it to the GL. You're sort of getting several wins there in one view. Okay. So moving on to the next component of the examples is financial control. So a couple of examples here where we've seen people really get some benefit and maybe some things that people, I think, were a little bit unique to some of our clients were doing is, I'll go down to the SOX control. So there's some TMSs that are out there that provide a little bit more of a workflow type of capabilities where you can sort of model out some of your processes. So we've had some of our clients have actually tried to embed or have embedded their actual Treasury specific SOX controls into their TMS. So as they're going through their actual workflow processes and they're going through how they utilize the system, they actually literally embed the controls into the system. And so when they're it gives them full visibility as opposed to some Excel sheet that has your list of controls on it and then somebody looks at once a year and forgets they're supposed to do something half the time. It sort of forces you to act that way, and you build the system around the controls, as well as it should facilitate your traceability. So when your auditors come in to look at the information, you have a system that essentially you can provide reports out of that facilitates it. And it was a very big value proposition for the client as well as their auditors, and really provide a lot of confidence to management as well as the internal controls group that everything was be put in place, and that client actually did it in conjunction with the internal audit team, so they actually allowed them to sort of opine on some of the controls. It was very much of a joint effort and gave them a good end product. One area where, again, if we have this data, how we're utilizing it is more some of this dashboarding and monitoring of controls and risk. So again, to the extent that you can think about who's going to use the information, we've had some clients who say, okay, well, I want to look at all my operational controls, and they're able to sort of put them all in one view and then leverage it more dynamically. That is something that is very desirable, and you can have the information in one page and sort of click through and see where your risks are very quickly. So it's taking that data that you have now and then organizing it in ways, and a couple of areas that we've seen clients leverage is these dashboards where they can sort of have a, depending on the system, dashboard, cockpit, whatever you want to call it, and it will really provide this information for these areas. Again, some of the areas on the payment side from a control perspective, I think Bob mentioned some of them, but obviously having stuff in a standardized format regarding payments is important, as well as some of the different checking that can be done. So some of the tools out there have additional checks on your payments that can help you from a compliance, which can help you on fees, as well as it can help you on some of the fraudulent components that Bob mentioned previously as well. Okay. So we get to the global visibility, and again, I mean, I would definitely echo what Bob said regarding it's not that you have the information, but now what are you going to actually do with it? And some examples of things that we've seen people do with it and be quite successful. I'll probably highlight here forecasting is one of the things. So if you think about it, if I have all this data in the system, so for instance, let's say I have my debt in the system, I have my investments, I have my hedges, I have a lot of forecasted information that can utilize for longer term forecasting in addition to short term on the forecasting side. So we've seen groups sort of try to merge or utilize all the information and to achieve what they need from both an FP&A group perspective as well as a Treasury perspective. And if you think about it, some of it is one is more of a free cash flow versus a forecasting and more of an accrual-based type of methodology. But the information can be used and can be essentially segregated into separate reports, but the same people, different people can utilize the same information and just have a different slice of it to achieve that. So we've had groups, as opposed to having a FP&A view and a Treasury view, there's, I would say, probably 70% overlap in the data that's being used and trying to get the data in one consistent place, but then manage it via a reporting tool and get the information out in different slices and dices. Again, is sort of centralizing information and bringing stuff into one place. Otherwise, what you're doing is you're sort of duplicating information. And what a lot of our clients are doing, and where they run into operational problems as well as controls, is they're replicating information in multiple places. So, what we have and what you see here on the next bullet is sort of one source of the truth. So if you have data in one place and everybody's using that same source of data, then you can sort of guarantee that whether you're using information for decisioning purposes, whether you're using it for external reporting purposes, regulatory purposes, whatever the case may be, you are all using the same source of data, which will greatly reduce your risk, improve your controls, as well as your financial decisioning making that you have here. So if you wanted to move on to the next, which I think we'll get into that next, is the decisioning piece. So as I sort of mentioned, if you have the one source of the truth, if you have the visibility, you set yourself up to have confidence in the information you have, and you also have analytical capabilities of it. So what can you do with that information? I think Bob mentioned some components of, if you have more visibility, you have more confidence, then you can obviously manage your funds better. A lot of our times our clients are able to greatly reduce the cushion that they have on a daily basis in their different accounts, which allows them to move that money in a more efficient manner and utilize it there. And obviously you can reduce your fees quite a bit as well. To the extent you have confidence in the information, then you should be able to minimize the different fees that you're incurring on the banking side, as well as look to more complex structures that you may have in place. We have some clients who would really like to go after and set up more complex structures, whether it be netting, whether it be pooling structures, or other payment on behalf of structures. A lot of the complaint that we get is, well, we don't have time to do that, or we don't have the level of information tracking, we don't have a tool to allow us to facilitate that, and it would just be too much data that we would have to track in one more manual spreadsheet. So once you have that data, a lot of these tools have capabilities to facilitate that. And again, if you have an automated process, then that operational concern goes away, as well as any risk that you may have of mistakes there, which will allow you to think about leveraging some structures that may be on the marketplace that can be really accretive to your value as an organization as well as your bottom line. With that said as well, there's a lot of reporting that you can leverage for that as well, which then feeds nicely into how can we become more of a strategic partner. I think this term is used quite a bit in the industry, and it's very aspirational, but the question is, well, how do I actually achieve that within my organization? And I guess the view I have on it is, well, Treasury, if you think about Treasury, a lot of the data within an organization that is needed by different groups flows through Treasury in one capacity or another. If you, on top of that, have a tool that you can utilize to capture that information and analyze the information, then now you're in a position of power within the organization, especially if your tool is better than the other people's tool, And you can really provide information and analysis across the organization. You can be predictive and say, oh, well, we've noticed this trend, and you can sort of start to be a provider of information across the organization, and people will start to come to you and ask you for information and analysis, and which will elevate your status into more of a strategic partner. Clearly, there's a level of effort to get to that place, but I think if we do take some of the steps that we've talked about previously to have the integration, to have the data in there, then you position yourself to do that and start to think about what additional value add you can provide to the organization and can be leveraged. A couple examples here in addition, we definitely have clients who are using it for more of a scenario analysis regarding to M&A activity. So a lot of our client CFOs are coming to the Treasury group and saying, well, here's the strategy, or here's the business we want to purchase. Can we purchase it? How would we fund it? And so having the tools where you have all the information in there, where you know where your future cash flows are going to come from, either on the inflow or outflow side, and allow to layer on potential scenarios or analysis of cash flow, in addition to potentially hedging some of that, any risk that you have there, are great tools that really put you in a conversation on the M&A side that you may not be otherwise, as well as on the expansion side. So again, a lot of the relationships are maintained from the Treasury group with the banks, and as you go into geographic expansion, to the extent you have those relationships, you can potentially say, well, we can help you guys get up and running with bank accounts. We have these global relationships with certain banks. We can help you expand to those regions. Again, it puts you in the forefront of some of those conversations, which is a nice place to be. And then again, sort of trying to look forward and see what risk or trends may be in the business. To the extent you have all the information and the data flowing through the system, you may be in a position to analyze certain cash flows or trends that you can bring forth to the other areas of the business where maybe they don't have that level of analysis. Again, they should, but you have in a powerful position if you can leverage the data to achieve it. Okay. And I guess, so that was all positive or potentially positive. I guess I wanted to leave it with an area where I guess I would encourage a lot of you out there, as well as the vendors, these are some areas where I would like to see, or I've seen potentially some of the tools out there fall down. I've seen a lot of our clients asking for these things, and it's just really more of a, we'll call it aspirational things that I think could be improved with the technology that's out there, and hopefully, and it will. And again, I've seen a lot of vendors working towards these, but it's not a panacea yet. There's still a lot of room for improvement, and these are some areas that I personally think are some key areas that we need to see some improvement in the industry. Certain things we've seen clients want to leverage is payments. So a lot of information, okay, well, I know I have to execute my payments, but how do I execute them? How can I minimize certain fees that I have? How can I route them in a way that's more dynamic and based on some type of more decisioning based of desires or things that we've seen, and we have not seen really great tools within the TMS space to achieve that thus far. Mobile reporting, I think you'll see that there's a lot of vendors out there who have mobile capabilities, but I would say they're typically very limited in the functionality that's there, improving rapidly, but still limited to more of a, well, I can see a report or I can approve a payment, which is a good first step, but it's definitely not a seamless integration across all functionality and navigation of the system. You definitely notice a difference. There's definitely a large step down in the functionality that you can leverage for the most part across the mobile tools, and as more and more people, that's how they're getting used to doing things, from looking at news to other aspects. I think it's important that the Treasury technology follows suit and ups their game there. And on the reporting side as well. I think there's been a lot of improvement in reporting, but at the same time, to the extent you're able to get all this data in one place, if you can't use it in the way you want, if you have limitations in the reporting, then you're going to be back in Excel, which is exactly what we would like to have. We would all like to avoid, because if you have the data in the tool, but you can't get the reporting out of it, then you're really not able to leverage the full value, and you're really going back to taking a step back as opposed to a step forward. All right, Bob, I think that was it for me.
Yeah, thank you, Chad. I like the insight, and There's a lot of good points to be made there. I mean, if we summarize what we've been talking about through the whole presentation, number one, business case is just part of the game. If you have a TMS and you want a better one, then you need to make a business case. If you don't have a TMS and you think, oh, there's some really great ideas that came through here, I really need to find a way that I can get that. Well, what we're saying here is that productivity is important. Chad said it perfectly. It's the base. You build your house upon it. It's the foundation. But if you really want to find the value of TMS, you really want to convince senior management this is something to be spent, to spend budget on, then there has to be more than productivity to justify that value. And that value of the technology really is in the decisions that can be enabled. What decisions, what programs, what projects can you actually undertake by, it may just be simply because I have X amount of hours taken out of my day that I don't have to spend time on anymore because it's all been automated. Now I can do X, Y, and Z. And if I can do those things, then the value that's been enabled by the technology, maybe that's all it is. Maybe it's some of these Treasury decisions, even some of the examples that Chad gave about having Treasury be that partner to the business, to be able to enable movement into new markets, to be able to finance suppliers and customers to grow the value chain of the entire business. I mean, these seem, wow, those are aspirational for Treasury, yes, but they're also real. You know, there's nothing that Chad and I are talking about that it's not all hypothetical. These are things that have happened. We've seen organizations, we see treasurers, we see assistant treasurers that are seeing opportunities for Treasury to become bigger and more influential within the organization. And technology is always the root. You don't find anyone that's progressed and being able to accomplish significant things in Treasury that doesn't have technology there to really build that foundation to work from, to enable the productivity, which once you clear off the productivity, it allows you to get to establishing financial controls and ensuring that you actually have time to focus on fraud prevention, as an example. Obviously, once you get to that point, your next step is, I want greater visibility. You suddenly have a thirst for more data and more information. And having that thirst means that you can start making better decisions around cash, around liquidity, around mobility of your financial resources, about hedging, around being that that strategic collaborator, to be able to offer that insight to the others in the organization to say, hey, we know about FX over here in Treasury. We're experts in what currency volatility is. Here's things you need to know when you're setting up shop in China or India or other geographic market that maybe the organization needs some of that expertise and that wisdom to do effectively. So overall, I think there's an excellent insight. We wanted to give you ideas. We're not solving everything. Certainly, you know, the contribution insight that Chad and his team at Actualize can provide goes well beyond just a couple words in a webinar. And in many cases, it might be an engagement that can help you be able to understand and uncover that business value. So with that, we have a little bit of time for questions, not a tremendous amount, and I see a bit of a lineup of questions as well. So we'll certainly go through as many as we can here. But first things first, well, let's see, I'm reading through the questions here. Okay, here's a simple one. And Chad, this is probably a good one for you. How should Treasury measure success? Success is quoted. So we'll say success is maybe the subjective term in this. How should Treasury measure success using a TMS? So Chad, what do you think? It's not too bad a one.
Sure. You know, we have treasury groups who put in KPIs that allow you to have a more measurable outcome. So I think it's a great question, right? So you put all this effort in, you have it there. How do I actually achieve success? So certain things that you should be able to achieve. There's some, again, more basic ones, which would be around the payment side, so that I don't have, you know, I have a certain number of payment mix. So for instance, I'm making a mix so I minimize the amount of actual cash checks that I have versus wires versus ACH versus other, you know, less expensive type of payment forms. We have stuff that's around fees and late charges, so they want to minimize those charges. We also have things around you know, errors regarding to interest payments that they make, or any type of even responsiveness to other groups. So as we think about if they're now a constituent of information, they actually have some service level agreements with other groups and saying, well, we want to respond to this question within a day or within 48 hours or something along those lines. So there's some pretty interesting KPIs that we've seen people put in place to actually monitor this on a more go-forward basis, as well as, I guess I would say, again, not that the TMS is a panacea of everything, but you can leverage the TMS to actually produce the information that you need for the KPI in most cases.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, and I would echo that completely. KPIs are important, and feedback loops are important, and also assessing your before and after. There's a couple examples, and Chad talked about them, and so did I, is that sometimes you need to either use data historically or maybe even expectations going forward and saying, here's what our life looks like with technology and here's what it looks like without. And that can help quantify things so that you can not only justify going into it, but also assess afterwards, did I meet my objectives? So I think it's a good question, but Chad, thank you. It's a good answer as well. There's a couple questions in here. I'm going to combine a few just because we're really at the top of the hour. There's a couple questions asking about the math. No, those are hypothetical examples, obviously. As an example, 10 million idle cash, how does that become 100,000 a year in benefit? Well, if you do the math, 1%, 10 million becomes 100,000. That was how that worked. Same on the hedging, a little bit more complicated. They're just meant to be hypothetical examples. You can certainly, when you get the slides, when they're emailed to you in a few days, you can go through some of those. And your assumptions, your variables, your metrics will probably be a bit different. So it's not meant to be copy and paste into your business case necessarily, but it's a way of thinking of how do I want to approach that. So that would kind of be my answer to the 3 or 4 questions that asked about that. Looks like we have time for one more question. There's one about Swift fraud. I think I'll leave that one alone for the moment, but I will answer this one. Kind of a funny, I think it's funny, it's meant to be anyway, hopefully. Basically saying my whole business case for TMS was justified on time savings and it went really well. Are you suggesting that time savings are not important for Treasury? Well, kind of, actually, to be honest about it. It's not really saying it's not important. It's just not enough to build most business cases on. So go back to Chad's words, because I like the way he phrased it. Did a better job than I did about saying it. Productivity is your foundation that you build upon. If you just stop at the foundation, you don't have a whole house. And if you showed someone a house and said, great, here's the foundation, like, yeah, it looks pretty good, where's the rest of it? Well, that's the same thing here. Where's the rest of it? And there's more value in just the foundation. The value is the first story, the second story, the roof, the yard, all of those sorts of things. I'm trying to take that analogy a little far, but you get the idea is that there's more value to come after productivity. Productivity enables the next step, maybe establishing financial controls, maybe getting better visibility, and ultimately making decisions that have a lot more value than just a certain amount of hours saved in a day. Hours saved in a day are driven off basically the cost of an FTE, the cost of your job as an example. And, well, that's probably great. That being said, there's a lot more to it. You can't take productivity benefits and generate millions of dollars a year in benefit or value generated. It's just not going to be very likely except in the very largest Treasury organizations. But that being said, having better cash mobility, having better liquidity decisions, paying down debt, being able to protect more of your cash flows from volatility in foreign exchange, that's going to get you potentially into that 7. In some cases, I've seen 8-figure benefits. Again, that's for larger organizations, but you get the idea, is that that's where the value comes. And do you want a business case that just, yeah, that seems pretty good. That's an ROI of 1.5 years. Yeah, not too bad. Yeah, we'll do that next year. That's kind of like an answer that a lot of people run into. Versus, here's an ROI that literally pays for itself in the first 3 days of having the technology. That is something that's pretty interesting. And even though it sounds very hypothetical, like there's no way that could really happen, it can if you do the project right. And of course, and to Chad's point in one of the questions a moment ago, if you're able to prove that you generated that value, the gold star that goes beside your name from a personal career path perspective, that is pretty, I'd say, significant as well, and worth pursuing if for no other reason than just making yourself more valuable and interesting to the organization. So with that, I know there's a few more questions. We can answer those ones offline for you. But I do want to say thank you, Chad. I really appreciate your contribution. Excellent examples, great insight. I know they're all real-life stuff, even if you have to keep the company names out of it. But I thank you for everything that you said, and certainly look forward to engaging you and with our prospects and clients in the future. So thank you, Chad. And thank you all for attending. Hope you enjoyed it, and we will definitely send out the presentation as well as the recordings to you in the next couple of days and give you the appropriate documentation for your CTB credits. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time and look forward to speaking with you in the next webinar.
Thanks. Bye.